This was actually a very progressive approach by the federal government. So their idea was, we're going to set this land aside. The treaty is what we're going to agree to. We're going to give you this land. That's yours. You're going to be left alone from Western culture. You'll be able to do that over there. We'll do what we're doing over here. So you're safe and we're safe and we don't have to fight about things.
You think that most Indigenous communities should be looking at what can we do to put in improvements and build?
You do not have to build to code on reserve land. We're going to see new water upgrades, 31 new units in the next 18 months. Cultural center, parks, we're going to be able to develop that like you would develop any other community. The federal government has not done the level of investment in housing that we've ever needed, but they've given us enough to do the bare minimum. But we're going to work with you because we recognize that Indigenous people are overrepresented in the homeless population, in the incarceration rate. A large reason that you find people who are homeless is because they cannot move back to their own community and find proper housing.
Welcome to the Tom Storey Show with Steve Karrasch and Tom Storey, where we discuss everything real estate or whatever else is on our minds.
Welcome back to the Tom Storey Show. I appreciate you being here. This week's guest is Aaron Peat. Aaron is the host of the Bigger Than Me podcast. Aaron, you do an amazing job. I was actually introduced to your content from Steve. It's very rare that Steve sends me somebody else's content other than like a dumb comedy podcast. And I'm like, I'm not watching that. So he loves what you're doing. I did a bunch of research heading into this to see what you're doing. And we appreciate you being here. So thanks so much for being on the show.
It's an honor to be here. May I ask what stood out to you, Steve, that I recorded?
Oh, you are a pro at this, because I was going to get into that. So I found your podcast during the BC election, because you had on all of the big leaders, even before some of them weren't leaders anymore of their parties. But it was that. So it was, I want to say, the David Eby one that came out, and I was like, okay, I don't agree with the guy. We've actually had Ravi Kalin on the podcast twice. So we've had the housing minister on. But then I thought I should probably learn what David Eby has to say. And I, found out I'm not an NDP supporter anymore. I was under Horgan, actually. And then when you had Rustad on, everybody was throwing so much hate towards the guy. I was like, I better learn what Rustad's about. And obviously that episode for you did who knows how many tens of thousands of views. So that was where I got exposed to you, and I've kind of kept an eye on it. I haven't hit every episode, but like there's some really good stuff. And the reason I wanted to have you on is because I learned that you're, of an Indigenous background. We haven't explored that topic yet. As realtors here in BC, we are inundated with learning about it. I don't ever want to touch the treaty lands as far as my real estate transactions go, because I'm not specialized enough to know about it. And I was like, who can I talk to about this that is not going to get offended if I say the wrong words?
That's
right?
True.
And I was like, oh, this guy, you look like a kid. I don't know how old you are, but I was like, this guy seems like he knows what he's talking about. And even though it may not be your speciality here in actual real estate, my understanding is you're a counselor with your local community. And so I was like, this makes a lot of sense. And then there was one point, I think it was an episode. It was like a fairly controversial episode, or would be normally. Maybe even where you were having a discussion about like denialism of residential schools and that sort of thing. Or it could have been one of the right-wing wacko reporters that you have on every once in a while. I like how you go both sides, by the way. But then you made a comment, something about, do you know why Indigenous lands are the way they are?
Yeah.
And I did not know. And I could tell all the listeners also didn't know. So I was like, okay, this is a topic. This is actually a reason I can reach out and say, hey, I like what you're doing. But also we can actually have a conversation about this now. So maybe you can, I would like to know more though about, and I know Tom has no idea of your situation. So I'd like to know more, like, who is Aaron Peat, to give us a little bit of background for our listeners who likely may not have seen you before.
Sounds good. So I think I'll start from often within First Nations culture, we'll go kind of 7 generations. So I'll just go back. My grandmother attended St. Mary's Indian Residential School, which was located in Mission, British Columbia. And she faced abuse there. She struggled with alcoholism her entire life. because of the trauma that she had faced. And my mother was born with fetal alcohol syndrome disorder as a consequence of her using alcohol to cope with the trauma that she went through. So I was raised by a single mother with a disability, and we grew up in downtown Chilliwack in a very small apartment, and faced a lot of challenges, relied on social assistance and community support, food banks, stuff like that throughout my life. And so I would say that I come from a world where hard work is really important, that pulling your socks up and getting to work and trying to make something of yourself is ingrained in me, and something that I try and encourage others to consider. We are in what I would say is like a bit of a victim mentality right now, where there is a currency to talking about the challenges you faced. For me, the only like benefit is that I have a work ethic that I think is at times stronger than my peers, and that will take you farther than any amount of referring to your victimhood. So I try and bring that and hear from different perspectives, as you described. I struggled a lot with trying to understand the relationship between my First Nation community and me, because I grew up off reserve my entire life. And so joining council was a huge change. I got my undergraduate degree from the University of the Fraser Valley in criminology and criminal justice, and then went on to do a law degree, and graduated from that, and then ran for council for my community, interested in trying to better the community, and have learned a lot about the systems that we're kind of talking about, the reserve system and how it operates, how it affects people, and why it brings out, I think, some of the results that we see on the reserve. So that's a little bit about my background.
So what is your is your job title then counselor? Like, is that your full-time gig, or you got a law degree as well? Like,
so yes, being on council is a part-time position. At times it feels like my evening life. And then I'm also the strategic relations manager for Métis Nation BC, where my role is basically to build relationships between Métis people and First Nations. People may not know, but there's a bit of a divide between the two communities. First Nations have rights and title interests within British Columbia. Title means that we have reserve interests, that we have interest in kind of having that acknowledged through land acknowledgements and stuff like that, but also looking at repurchasing land and having some reserve land returned to us that was taken away, where Métis people only have rights within British Columbia, and so they don't have title interests. And at times I think that gets confused or miscommunicated, and so there can be a divide where First Nations think that Métis are coming for their land, and UBCIC has written several reports just saying like, hey, like Métis people, don't colonize us again. Don't try and claim our land as your land, and issues like that arise. And so my role is to try and bridge those gaps.
Have you found over the past few years that those conversations are going in a more positive direction with both sides for what you're doing?
I certainly hope so. Like, that's the feeling I get. I find there are political level organizations like the Union of BC Indian Chiefs or the BCAFN. Their job is to advocate for all First Nations people. So they're a politically motivated organization, whereas individual First Nation communities don't have those type of gripes. And I think that's a theme you'll find throughout this conversation. One question I've always been asked is like, why do you keep changing your names? You went from Indians to Natives to Aboriginal to First Nations to Indigenous. Like, why all the name changes? And it's like, no First Nation community has ever driven that ever in the history of the planet. Like, we are trying to rise out of poverty here, and it's usually the federal or provincial government who's going, what should we call them? Like, what's more politically correct that we could hit on those notes? Like, that's not a priority. Like, a lot of my community still refers to themselves as Indians or Natives. They're not up with the latest political lingo.
Would they be offended if someone that wasn't from their community called them that? Or at this point, it's just Indigenous is the term that they'd like to be called? Or do they not care as much as maybe we think?
What I find personally is people within universities, people who have a finger on the pulse of political news would care a lot more about that than if you came to my community and met with someone and called them Native instead of Indigenous. I don't think they would even notice.
I actually asked Steve before we started recording, before you came on, I was like, can I use the word Aboriginal still? I didn't know.
Yeah. So, and like, just, I don't know if it's interesting, but like Indian was because the settlers came, they were confused. They thought they had reached India. They were mistaken. they arrived in the wrong location. So that name kind of stuck for a long period of time. My status card still calls me an Indian. I'm still an Indian under the Indian Act. I love the Jordan Petersons and those people who are kind of like, there is no systemic racism, but I do think you could refer, like, if anybody asked, like, what's proof of some systemic racism, that law is probably pretty still on the nose of being a racist policy that still exists today. It's a very old document that still says that the Crown is responsible for Indians, kind of thing. So that's just one piece of legislation I think is needs some updating, and it's always a controversy how you go about updating it. Then we went to natives. I don't think that's a bad term. I don't think that's incorrect. We're native to this land. Then it went to Aboriginal. There was a dream of, like, we're comparable to what's happening in Australia. They're called Aborigines. And so there was kind of an assumption that that would be the next term. That one didn't end up sticking. And so then it went to breaking it down. And I think this is the one that's going to stick if I had to place my bets. And it's Indigenous as an overarching group. And then you have 3 subcategories: Métis, Inuit, and First Nations, which are subcategories.
So Tom has gone through exactly what you highlighted. So Tom's in Toronto. I'm in Surrey. Everybody in Toronto is sitting there worried about, what do we call these folks that were here before us? And Aaron's sitting here going, we got way bigger problems than that, guys. Yeah. Like, let's worry about some of the things that we have going on. So the thing that made me reach out was definitely that comment about why the lands are that way. So there may be people listening, like, for instance, where Tom is, where there's probably not as much reserve land around him as there is. I mean, I'm close to Tsawwassen. I'm in Delta actually right now. I'm close to Tsawwassen. I know there's a lot of development in Vancouver and those areas where it's like they're getting us prepped to deal with reserve land or whatever. Again, I don't even know what the right name there is half the time. Treaty land, all this different stuff. But you made a comment about, do you understand why it is that way, to one of your guests? Do you remember making that comment?
Yeah, it was to Candice Malcolm.
Okay, so can you maybe elaborate on that? Because I am half a moron and I can't explain this properly. So can you maybe explain to us the reservation system, maybe even how it came to be, and why Indigenous folks think of land in the way they do, or how they think of it in the way they do?
Happy to. And I will try and tie in where I think Candice makes some compelling arguments that are hard to entertain. So the reserve system, the idea is that First Nations were a communal people, that we had tribes, that we had communities, and so we would set aside land so that they could continue those types of practices. And so when you're living in a community, just like you would in Delta, you have homes in a certain area, you have areas where you store stuff. It's all set up so people can work together to grow, harvest. We did have entrepreneurs. We had people within the British. I can't speak as much to what's going on in Toronto, but we had people all the way up from Alaska traveling all the way down to California and trading, working through the Ulican trails and doing a lot of different types of projects. And First Nations people were good at specializing in certain projects. Again, to Candice's point, there was also war. There was also the Kwakwaka'wakw attacking the Stolo people. So contrary to kind of the story that is regularly told, there were disagreements. There was not peace and harmony and warm fuzzy hanging out at all times. Indigenous people also owned slaves prior to contact as well. So those are just pieces that I think people on the right feel like their side of the argument is not being heard. In all fairness, it was a complicated part of our history, but those things were also taking place. So the idea was that you had land that you were going to set aside for the Indians. You were going to put this aside and allow them to continue to live how they were living. Even within Tommy Douglas, his idea was to have what was called anticipatory reserves. So the idea was you wouldn't just plan for where they are today, but you would make a larger scale plot of land so that people can grow into those communities. So you would set that aside for their future. That has benefits and is certainly culturally appropriate. Again, just going a little bit into the weeds, is the idea was that you wouldn't be allowed to alter the land in a way that would impact future generations. And so the challenge that we have today is, say you build a giant skyscraper, that's impacting that land for the next 65 to 100 years. You've locked that in. It's unlikely that's going to be torn down, and you're going to return it to a grassy farmland in the near future. So the idea was, we're going to commit this, and then you can't do anything that would impact future generations. Within the Stolo culture, we have this idea of Tomyuk, where you look 7 generations into the future. So if everybody could agree that you want to change the land, you have to consider those future generations and how it's going to impact them, which I really like. The challenge in today's climate is nobody really thinks of it that way. We've kind of forgotten why the reserve system exists, and it for a very long time it was a barrier to be able to be produced and to utilize that land in a useful way in today's economy. So that's a little bit of the history of the reserve system.
So given that, that thought of, hey, we can't impact this for the future, do you think that holds back then some of the potential upside to, like you mentioned, like maybe get the communities out of these poverty situations? Like if you don't want to build anything that's not going to be there in 35 years, then you're not going to have a lot of structures. You're not going to modernize at all. And doesn't that kind of put you in a counterproductive scenario? Like if you're asking for from the federal government, let's say, money to put in infrastructure within a reserve, and then you basically have this thought of, we don't want to build anything in the reserve, isn't that counterproductive?
Your real estate website should work as hard as you do, and that's where Realty Ninja comes in to create a beautiful website that helps you convert online leads, that doesn't give you all these tech issues and will match with the brand that you already have. Steve's been using Realty Ninja for over 10 years, and we have a promo code for listeners of the Tom Storey Show. RealtyNinja.com/Tom will give you 20% off your first year, and you don't pay $1 until your website launches. RealtyNinja.com/Tom. And now, back to the podcast.
It's an interesting point. I guess I'll go a little bit more into detail. So there's also, in the 1990s, there was this idea called certificate of possession. And the idea was almost to just move away from this model that you're describing that may have held things up. It was, we're going to assign plots of land, and you won't have the same level of autonomy as a fee simple property. You still have to communicate with the band, sort of like what you have with a municipality. You can't just do anything. You have to speak about zoning and how things are going to be set up. But this is your parcel of land, and you'll be able to develop it how you like. What I've seen within our region is that has just created a Hatfields and McCoys type of situation, where one family's like, this is our plot of land, and one other is like, this is our plot of land, and neither of them are developing on their land, but they're very staunch on that is their plot of land. And as you'll see, it's kind of created just infighting with no potential solutions over the long term. And then you did mention treaties. I think it's worth just noting that treaties were being swept across the country from east to west and never reached British Columbia, because British Columbia First Nations watched as treaties came about from east to west and saw that most of the time the agreements didn't end up coming to fruition in the way that the First Nations had hoped or had agreed to. And again, the Candace Malcolms, the Nigel Bigars are going to point out this was actually a very progressive approach by the federal government, by Sir John A. Macdonald and others, that were willing to try and find a safe harbor for First Nations people, that they were committed to finding some sort of middle ground for them, because they had done things in other territories, including New Zealand, Australia, where they just went to war with them, and they saw that as not a productive way to move forward. And so a lot of First Nations people died as a consequence of the Black Plague and other diseases, not as a consequence of war. Wars did happen, but they were less than what had happened in other countries. And so their idea was, we're going to set the land aside, and we're going to come to agreement. The treaty is what we're going to agree to. We're going to give you this land. That's yours. You're going to be left alone from Western culture coming in and interrupting your way of living. You'll be able to do that over there. We'll do what we're doing over here. And that's how we'll kind of separate things, so you're safe and we're safe and we don't have to fight about things. What I would say that we've seen the result of that is that you do have communities that are in larger levels of poverty. A lot of those treaties don't update. So there was agreements in there that they would give a certain amount of money, and it was like 50 cents for every person, and that's just never changed. And so like 50 cents is still 50 cents. And so some of the agreements are outdated, and they're trying to update them again as reconciliation takes place. But there's just some odd things that you'll see in some of those treaties where BC doesn't have that. And so you'll see, you mentioned Chawathil, they entered a modern treaty, and they're one of the first in a very long time to do so. And it is more flexible, and it is able to be updated in a different way than those traditional treaties were.
So as agents here, we do have, there's lands in Vancouver that are now being developed. Chawathil is being developed like crazy into, I would guess, what is leasehold, basically houses and townhouses and condos and that sort of thing. Is that something, like, I guess that's the individual reserve itself, or the band itself, that's going to decide what they want to do with those lands and how they're going to move forward? Is that how it works?
Correct. So each community, so like Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, they're able to make their own decisions, and we're able to make our own decisions. Within my community, we have kind of two main reserves. One is focused more on CP properties, so certificate of possession. So there's a lot of infighting about how those parcels will be developed, who has ownership over doing that, what are the policies, how are we going to proceed. That one's at loggerheads oftentimes on how to proceed. The other is what we call SCAM, and that one's much easier for us to develop. That is purely banned land. And so I am able to reach out to BC Housing, to other organizations, and go, we're ready to develop here. So that community, we're expecting to see sewage systems. We're going to see new water upgrades. We're going to see BC Housing units, 31 new units in the next 18 months. We're hoping to see a childcare program go there, and a cultural center, parks. We're going to be able to develop that, and like you would develop any other community. And we are doing extensive community consultation to make sure that's what the community wants, because we're committing the land for probably the next 65 years to some of these purposes. And those, like BC Housing is a phenomenal partner. When I spoke to Premier Eby, as you spoke about earlier, I complimented that program because the federal government has not done the level of investment in housing that we've ever needed. CMHC has never done the investment in housing that we've needed. They've often given us dollars, and this goes to kind of the quality of life question. They've given us dollars, but they've given us enough to do the bare minimum, to not finish the basement, to not have proper carports, to not have proper surrounding infrastructure. And that's how it's been for the past 40 years. BC Housing is coming in for the first time ever in the reserve system and going, we're a provincial partner. We have no obligations to you because it's federal land. But we're going to work with you because we recognize that Indigenous people are overrepresented in the homeless population, in the incarceration rates, and that a large reason that you find people who are homeless is because they cannot move back to their own community and find proper housing. And so we're going to work with you and address that issue. And they have been doing that since John Horgan came to power. And we are seeing significant changes because people are able to move home back to their community. My community, we just did an open house the other night, and it went really well because we were talking about these are properly maintained. These are actually built to code. You do not have to build to code on reserve land because you're not on the provincial land, you're not on municipal land, so there's no code that you have to follow. We're still going to hold to code, and we're going to give you operation and maintenance dollars to make sure that they don't become decrepit, mold infested homes.
So what's your personal belief? I guess you're trying to manage it from both sides, being basically, I mean, if you want to call it a member of government or a councillor or whatever, you're seeing concerns from all sorts of different angles. What's your thought with what should be done? Is it so dependent on where you're located and what the people want? Or do you think that most Indigenous communities should be looking at what can we do to put in what we would consider to be in the Western world improvements and build, and or how much do you weigh that against, traditions and all these things where we don't want things to change and we want it to be like it was for our ancestors hundreds of years ago?
I'm a very progressive leader. I think there's ways to honor all of that history in a way that allows people to not live in abject poverty. But going back to like one of the questions that you asked about, like individual First Nations are choosing to do gigantic developments where they're doing leaseholds and stuff. I am not a proponent of that personally. I'm not in the situation where my community is really at risk of that. My community is in Hope, British Columbia. We have a population of around 7,000 people. There's no real big push that we need to develop our community's land. But I do, just going back to like, what are the causes of this problem? We do not have an increasing population because everybody's having a lot of children. We have an increasing population mainly because of immigration. And we have had federal political leaders admit that immigration is a huge reason for our housing crisis, and they chose not to slow that down. We also have an aging population who have a vested interest in the value of their home increasing, not decreasing. And so within my culture, just like I think there's a lot that we can learn from each other, culture to culture. My culture believes in honoring our elders and taking care of them in a way that they wouldn't have to do what I find a lot of Western elders need to do in order to have a very comfortable retirement. Your Western elders have to kind of think about themselves first, because they often live on their own until they're ready to go into a home, and then they go into a home and their children don't visit them, and they're all by themselves. So they have to think a little bit selfishly towards the end of their life. Or at least that's kind of the trend that you see. I'm not saying every elder is like that, but that is one of the challenges that we have. We have more and more senior care homes. You're not having those individuals move back home with their children and be taken care of by their children. Where within my culture, that is a huge priority. You see that within East Indian cultures, that taking care of your parents is a responsibility. It's a privilege. It's an opportunity to learn from them. We don't see that within the Western kind of model. And I think that's an area in which there could be some learning that takes place, because that does, like my mother lives with me. I support her. I do the grocery shopping for her. On the one hand, I learn a lot from her. I get to stay connected to my family. On the other hand, it reduces my bills. I don't have to worry as much about carrying all of that just on my own shoulders. And so we just have two very different philosophies on that front. And so when I look at what's going on with Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, within the Chilliwack area, we have Sheacton looking at these major developments. I'm not saying they shouldn't do that, but I just think, well, the root of the problem is immigration rates. And for the most part, no offense to anybody, nobody really cared about the reserve system until it could fix their problems. And so you're seeing this increased interest in, how do we do this? How would we develop this? What does it look like? And we have a lot of people within my region very interested all of a sudden in how the reserve system works. And they weren't overly interested 30 years ago when people were living in significant rates of poverty. And so that's where this reconciliation conversation comes in. This is an opportunity for economic development. This is an opportunity to address a crisis that the Western world has. But I would say it's a self-inflicted wound, that a lot of these problems came from decisions made by government to increase immigration rates and not keep that at pace with the housing developments. And so now we need creative solutions, and reserve land is really good because it's federal land. There's a lot more flexibility on how First Nations want to develop it. There's way less red tape than you see in municipalities in the province. And so you're able to move far faster. But I would say that they're selling over the next 100 years, I would predict they're selling a subpar product from my perspective. I have no interest in owning a 99-year lease on a property. I don't think over the long term, people are going to be interested in owning something that depreciates in value. I often try and make sure that my members, when they consider developing on our land, compare it more to a car than owning a house, because the land underneath can increase in value over the lifetime of the property's existence. It's not usually the structure that's increasing in value. And when you're investing in these 99-year leases, you're often investing in the structure more than you're investing in the land, because you're not going to have that land in 99 years. And so I think it's a subpar product. I think it addresses a current problem, but say we fix this housing problem in the next 20 years. Well, nobody's going to want those units. Nobody's going to be interested in owning that property, because it's not as good as the potential ownership of an actual property that you own for the lifetime of it. And when you sell it, it's increased in value. All of these products are going to be something that you sell off at a lower rate than you potentially brought in at, because it's not as valuable. And ultimately, the First Nation holds the interest over the long term anyways.
Tom, I don't know if you're familiar with if you've ever done it, or if you've ever done a deal in regards to lease. I for exactly the reasons that you bring up, Aaron, I steer all my clients away from any of that Tsawwassen stuff. Like, you don't want to own a 99-year rental, because that's basically what you're owning when you own that. And I actually have, now I was very young. I had no idea what was really going on. But when the stuff in South Vancouver went on, there was a 99-year lease in place, and every 33 years, they were allowed to, I guess the lease was able to be renegotiated. And at the 33-year point, it was just like, nah, we're not going to renegotiate. We're taking back all our land. And those people literally lost their homes earlier than they just had to walk away from it, right? So it is a real problem. And I just think the government, maybe for the reasons that you are pointing out, Aaron, is the government is looking at it going, it's kind of cheap land. We can kind of throw some money at it, and maybe we can put affordable housing in there, even though those people don't own the home, which I mean, I am all for home ownership. I think we should be owning homes. And so that's where I think could be a problem maybe in the reserve system, because if there's not, I guess it's a question for you. Do you think that, like, if you don't give title to someone and like you own this and you're going to take responsibility for this, if you don't give them that and they don't have a feel of pride of ownership, do you think that may be part of the problem with letting these properties, say, not be maintained properly? Because I mean, I've been on a few reserves in my day, and yeah, there's poverty, but it also feels like there's just no desire to maybe even keep up with those homes, because maybe I'm coming out that's totally wrong, and stop me if I am, but do those people maybe not feel like they have ownership over something, so they don't really care about it?
It is one of the challenges, I would certainly agree, is like a factor that it always comes down to. Drive past even a Western rental versus somebody who owns their home and look at their yard and decide which one actually cares more about the property.
Hey folks, if you're looking for a real estate agent in the city of Toronto, let's face it, you gotta call my buddy Tom Storey of the Storey team and Royal LePage Signature in Toronto, Ontario. They're your obvious choice, because Tom is not just the co-host of this podcast. No, he is a real life and top producing real estate agent in the city of Toronto. There's nobody out there that knows the condo market better than Tom and his team in downtown, but they do service the entire city of Toronto and any of your residential real estate needs. So if you're looking for an agent, do not hesitate to reach out to Tom, book a call with him using the link down below in the description of this podcast, and let Tom guide you through your real estate journey. And now back to the podcast.
And you can pretty clearly see that when you own it, there's a sense of pride, there's a sense of responsibility over it. There's fitting in with the Joneses that you don't have as much when you're just a renter and you could be out of there in 6 months. There's just a different vision that you have for yourself over the long term. I would say that we have seen communities be able to address that issue relatively easily once they kind of clear things up. I do think most people want to own a house, not an apartment, not a townhouse, not a condo. They would like to own an actual house where they have a backyard, where they have a place for their kids to run, their dog to go to the bathroom and run around and do all the things they want to do. Most people, if you ask them, that's what they would actually prefer ultimately. And so there's a lot of reasons I think we see the circumstances you're describing on reserves. We have several of them within my area where there's violent crime. There is 15 people living in one house. The quality of homes aren't maintained. There's several reasons for that. One is that you have people who went through a lot of this trauma that we've talked about through Indian residential schools, through the 60s scoop, and they were never taught how to maintain a house. They were never taught how to clean their room. Or if they were taught those things, it was by force and by threat and by abuse. And so you have people who have a very complicated relationship with home maintenance. You also have people with undiagnosed disabilities living in a lot of these circumstances, like my mom. She doesn't have a formal diagnosis. We have a psychologist who confirmed that she has all of the symptoms of, but is unable to diagnose unless we go in for clinical testing. And so you have these people who kind of, you suspect, you might go, these people don't approach things the way I would approach things. You have people who struggle with substance use, addictions, and stuff like that living in these homes. So that's, I would say, if we had a pyramid, that's the meat and potatoes of the root. Then you have what investments have been made in their home. A lot of the members that I've spoken to, the home was not designed safely to begin with. And so there's a rejection that this is their home, that this is really what they wanted. The paint was never their choice. The fact that the hot water tank is right next to the wood stove, and that it's a dangerous circumstance to have those things so close together, and they would have never had it that way. The fact that they don't have air conditioning, the fact that they never got to choose anything about their home, and they're placed in there in a subpar home that's immediately getting mold and mildew and stuff, that there's like this isn't mine. This is somebody's, but it's not mine in a very deep way. And so there's kind of that, why would I maintain this if it doesn't feel like it's mine? And then you have just education, supporting people in understanding how to maintain it, giving them the resources so that it does. We've been able to renovate about 35 of 89 of our homes since I've come onto council. And now when people do have the color they want, they do have the cabinets they want, they do have the dishwasher they've always wanted, they do have the washer and dryer that they needed, there's a sense of, okay, now I'm ready to own this because this does feel like it's mine. And so we're starting to see that progress. Education, I think, is really important. And then resources. We have people who live on social development and are expected to own, and they have a giant quarter acre or a full acre of land, and they don't own a lawnmower, and they can't afford it. And so we're in the circumstance where you have this incredible property and you don't have any of the resources the person needs in order to maintain it. And how do you support a person who doesn't have extra money to get tree trimmers or like anything for their lawn, and they're expected to kind of upkeep their properties in a significant way? So you have all of those like more nuanced, littler challenges that I think you see. You go into a community and you go, whoa, like this does not look maintained, or it looks like I'm entering a different part of Canada when I drive onto these. Those are some of the contributing factors.
Aaron, you mentioned that you grew up off reserve, and from the conversation so far, I believe that your mother grew up on the reserve. Is that correct?
No, she was. My mom was actually, as a baby. Again, this just goes back to the crazy stories we have.
Yeah.
My grandmother left my mother outside when she was like recently born, and social development showed up and saw MCFD showed up, saw the conditions, and took her to Coquilitza Indian Hospital. Both her eardrums had already been blown out because of the cold weather, and the nurse there saw the care that my mom was going to need, always wanted a daughter, and chose to take her in and raise her as her own.
Wow.
That meant that she's part of what's called the 60 scoop, which is considered a bad thing, but for my family specifically, it was a good thing. And so this is, again, goes back to the Candace Malcolm argument of, hey, some people went to Indian residential schools and have amazing stories, and we don't hear much of those stories. And it's like, yes, it's like a lot of things. When the overall outcome was bad, it's very difficult for people to want to talk about any of the good. I am one of those rare outlier cases where my mom actually was a beneficiary of the 60 scoop system, but that does not mean that that was that way for everybody.
And growing up off the reserve, what was your relationship with the people that were living on the reserve growing up? Did you go visit it often? Like, what was that like? And then now, kind of further in your life, did you have a different perspective on things because you weren't living there, you're living somewhere else?
It's a tremendous question. So we would go visit for funerals or weddings or Christmas gatherings and stuff like that. And it was going to a completely different culture, and not Indigenous culture.
Okay.
A culture of, they did not have clean linens. They did not have a safe place for me to sleep. Everybody's at a bonfire drinking heavily. And I'm 8 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, going, whoa, this is such a different energy than I'm used to going to bed at 8 p.m. and up to school the next morning. There was a larger level of freedom and less rule following, I would say, in these communities as I was growing up. I think some of that has started to teeter off, and there's much more assimilation and consistency amongst how Western people and Indigenous communities operate. But there was just more of a freedom and less, I would say, a less of a norm in the community when I'd visit.
And when you were growing up, when you met people at school or whatnot, and you told them about your background, do they just immediately think like, oh, he grew up on a reserve? Is that where everyone's mind goes? Then you have to explain yourself every time? Or was it a little bit different?
I think it was different just because I lived like a block away from my elementary school and my middle school. And so people just like, I don't know if it was ever said, but like I didn't live close enough to a reserve for anybody to think that I came from there. And I also think I'm guilty of talking very Westernly, and I've done that most of my life. And so when you speak to me, I speak a bit like a nerd. And so most people don't think, if you're speaking the way I speak, that I'm coming from the reserve where there's a little bit more slang and stuff.
And it's also, Tom, just so you know, it's not an area where there's no other Indigenous folks, right? Like
Got it. Okay.
Chilliwack and definitely out to Hope. There's definitely different reserves in different spots. Like I have a lot of family in Chilliwack, and I spent a lot of my younger years getting up to no good in downtown Chilliwack on the streets there too. And I mean, it's not like, I mean, I'm from Surrey. When you say Indian in Surrey, you mean a different people than when you say Indian in Chilliwack, right? So I don't think it would be like a spot where you feel like you're left out from either one side or the other. There's probably more people, maybe not with your exact situation, but there's probably people that were straddling the line between living an Indigenous lifestyle and a Western lifestyle at the same time, I would assume.
Correct.
Yeah.
And then we did a little bit of investigative research for this interview. And what we mean by that is we went onto Instagram and we found out that you bought a house last year. So first of all, congratulations. And I'd love to know, we have a lot of people that listen to this show that are not homeowners yet. And like, what did it mean to you but you already talked about the fact that like people want to own homes. They want to have a backyard. What does it mean to you that now you are a homeowner? And what did you do to save up? How did you make this work? Because it's tough. Like, it's so expensive in all these markets that people are listening from. What was your experience like to get to home ownership?
Well, I guess I'll say from the outset, I have lived in an apartment my entire life up until being able to buy my first home. And so there was something incredibly invalidating about living in that circumstance. And when I hear people say they want to move to Vancouver and live in an apartment, it's really hard for me to comprehend, because you're governed by a strata. When I was 8 years old, I'd joke around too much past 10 p.m. You have somebody knocking at your door or trying to file a complaint against you. And that whole model I've hated my entire life, because it really prevented me from feeling like I could be a kid. And then it prevented me from feeling like I could watch the UFC until 12 o'clock at night or however late it's on till, and just be comfortable in my own space and not have to worry. I've never had a front door. And a lot of those things were like, they seem simple, but I've always had to carry my groceries up 3 flights of stairs, or wait for an elevator, or ride an elevator with another person with a ton of groceries in a cart trying to carry it up. And so just that whole experience was always exhausting. Coming home, I was a landscaper for a period, and people would get mad because I'd track in a little bit of mud onto the carpet. And just having everything I did micromanaged and responded to drove me mad. And so I am incredibly grateful to be out of that circumstance. And I would, of course, want that for others, to be able to experience the freedom and comfort of being able to be loud and not having a neighbor kind of get mad at you for that. It's been a goal of mine since I was very young to own my own place. And I remember having a conversation with one of my family members where he was like, you're probably not going to be able to buy like $1 million home. And like, in my mind, I'm very disagreeable. I took Jordan Peterson's personality assessment, and I scored in the top 99 percentile of disagreeable people. So when people tell me I can't do something, I get very like, I'm set on that. And so the reason that I went to law school and did the education that I did was with the belief that things could be better. And so I've been able to move on to that journey. It took a very long time of saving, planning. We met with a mortgage broker in June and just had that initial conversation. We didn't speak to a real estate agent. We just, what is possible for us? What's on the table? What's not on the table? And that conversation was very eye-opening. And then we started looking with their support. They had given us a document that basically said, you are good to start looking at homes within this kind of range. And so we started looking around. We found one place that we really liked. It had a very small backyard. It fit all of our needs. It was kind of in town, and ultimately somebody else ended up getting that deal, not us. And so we started looking around. We found another location with a 1/4 acre lot, and it had everything we wanted. It was a bit above our price range, which just meant I needed to work harder in order to save. Within British Columbia, we have the horrible property transfer tax, which I spoke to both David Eby about and John Rustad, and just criticized this terrible policy of over $1 million. Yep. You have to pay a property transfer tax of, for me, it was $25,500 just in property transfer tax in order to buy my first home.
Wait till you find out about Toronto. It's worse.
I can't even
crazy.
Yeah. But what a policy that they could address immediately that would allow, for the most part, like, again, David Eby and John Rustad were like, well, most people are buying under $1 million homes. And it's like, right. But like, I'm in a circumstance where I'm just above that threshold, and it's having a significant impact
Yeah.
on my ability to look at homes. And that money could be going towards the down payment, but instead it's going to the government to pay for our amazing healthcare services.
No, it's in a
what
good
is it
year,
going on?
Aaron. In a good year, Aaron, I think that's in a bad year, it's like $1.5 billion to the budget. In a
Yeah.
good year, I think it's something like $4 billion. It's never going away. And not only is it not going away, they're increasing it now on higher price properties because they know values will always go up. So it's like 3% or whatever on anything over $3 million and 5% on anything over $4 million or whatever the calculation is. And that's how they brought it in, because the calculation is still stupid. It's still 1% on the first $200,000 and then 2% on the balance up to 2 million or something, right? So they brought that in when the average house was below $200,000. So that's one of those things that's never going to go away. And it's one of the things that we rail on about, development and fees and all that sort of stuff. It's the biggest problem in housing everywhere is things like development fees. And so that's where I get frustrated when I heard, for instance, in Vancouver, I want to say they were going to announce affordable housing. And the province was going to pay, if you bought on the Indigenous land development that's going on, the province was going to pay something like 40% of your bill to purchase the home. So in their calculation, they were going to, I think it was like if a place was $800,000, the government was going to buy down that construction and pay, I guess, the band there, whoever owns it, the 40%. And that was just going to come out of the government. And then you could go buy that lease as an owner who only has to pay 60 per a leasehold owner who only had to pay something like 60%. And my thought is like, could we just not charge that tax and not necessarily have to buy these people 40% of their overpriced homes? But that doesn't seem to be, I mean, that's what you do so good on your channel, right? You actually get to these. First of all, I'll say you interview all sorts of people.
We need your booking agent, please.
Yeah, well, we do. We definitely need your booking agent. But like Maxime Bernier, to me, points out, who you just recently had on, points out all of the things that I like. I actually probably think like a People's Party person. That's probably who I am. But I'm smart enough to know that it's unrealistic. And then you had on, what was her name? Christina Gould. And then I realized that's how everybody wishes life would be. But I'm smart enough to know that that doesn't account for lazy people or idiots either. So I really commend that you have all those folks on. I don't even know what I'm talking about anymore. I'm just going to keep blabbering on here to say that it's an awesome show, and I encourage everybody here to go watch it.
I just want to leave with hope. I think there's a lot going on in the United States that's much to be desired, and there's a lot of pressure on a lot of Canadians and a lot of stress on them. Speaking with David Coletto, it sounds like a lot of Canadians are in a fear mindset right now on what's going on, and I really sympathize with that. The one thing we are seeing is a questioning of how much money are we spending and why. And I think that's my hope with shows like yours, with shows like mine, is that we're in this time of transition where we are educating the general public on things where we've all agreed on this for such a long time. Like when we go why wasn't I taught about how to pay taxes and how taxes work as a kid? Why is the government so focused on being able to pull out the taxes before I get my paycheck? Why is that the rule? Oh, it's because if we actually had to choose to pay the taxes, we would not pay the taxes, and we would be much more questioning why we're paying these taxes. These conversations are becoming more commonplace.
For tenant, landlord, or homeowner insurance policies, go to squareone.ca/The Tom Storey Show. Use the link in the description. Save $20 when you start your free quote right now.
I'm only 29 years old, but they're becoming very commonplace. And the responses I'm getting from the videos that I post is what the hell is going on around here? And I think for a very long time, we received a lot of input from the government, and there wasn't a two-way street of communication on whether we agreed or disagreed. It was sort of, you get two parties that are sort of similar and they have similar ideas, and you have to choose one of the two, and they kind of have the same platform. It's a little bit different. It's a little bit different there. We're in a time where we're kind of questioning the whole idea. And what John Rustad did in the last election is, to me, rather shocking. Like, we watched a whole party fall and a whole new party come in with no qualified, like, backed candidates, and really be able to come to power and challenge the NDP, which was running on kind of like we're going to do the same old. I have Ravi Kahlon, his interview releases next week, and it was like, what did you guys do wrong? Like, you guys think you've killed it, and you came very close to not winning this election.
Wasn't the number of votes at the end like so small that they actually ended up
24 in North Surrey?
Wow.
From a party that was from obscurity, that had not held a seat in like over 50 years. We're seeing these changes. We saw it in the US. We're seeing it in BC. I know David Coletto. I spoke to him. He's pretty confident that Mark Carney is going to be the guy to win this upcoming election, just because of how close the polls are, and because they're pitching Poilievre as somebody who would be too friendly to Trump or work too closely with him or be too aligned with his interests, that Mark Carney's going to win. I have a sneaking suspicion that we're seeing what happened, and I know we weren't going to get too much into politics.
No, let's go.
I have a suspicion we're seeing the Kamala Harris and
Yes.
the Donald Trump
100%.
run, where
Yeah.
it feels like it's 50-50, but
Yeah.
people are more angry from what I'm seeing. Like, I'm not politically biased, but from what I'm seeing, people are angry at the Liberals in a really deep way for a lot of the situations we see. Again, Justin Trudeau owned that the immigration challenge was on his team and was on his party, and that they were aware of it, and that they did not act soon enough. That is an owned mistake. That is not controversial to say. And that is a large reason why young people and people in general are not able to afford homes. I think there's a reckoning for some of the decisions that were made there, because they feel completely betrayed. And David Coletto questions whether or not, since Justin Trudeau's gone, maybe people can let it go and move on. I'm skeptical, because none of these problems are being solved, and we're just heading into an election. I know that he's put aside the carbon tax, and that was a major election issue, but we're in a time where the carbon tax wasn't the issue. It's, why are we paying all these taxes and they're not fixing the problems you, government, tell us that they're fixing? This carbon tax is meant to address the amount of CO2 going into the air. I have an interview coming up with David Suzuki, and he goes, the whole argument around the carbon tax is a non-starter. We are destroying this planet. We are increasing emissions. We are not doing what I have argued my whole life that we should be doing. We're not fixing the environmental crisis that we're being faced with in any way, shape, or form. And the carbon tax was a side issue. And it's just another tax. And that's how most people feel. The taxes are flying out the door, and our healthcare isn't tremendous. The services we're receiving aren't great. The roads we're driving are not fantastic. And yet we're paying more than we ever have in tax. And so I think there's going to be a reckoning. And I think that we're seeing progress with John Rustad being able to do what he did, that a lot of Canadians are kind of like, I am open to new ideas. I am open to challenging the status quo.
The problem is, so much of the voting base is in Toronto and Montreal, where they, for some reason, think the big Illuminati guy, who's the big banker, is going to come in and save the day, and they think he's better than that guy who, likes oil. So I don't know. I agree with you on everything you said. I do think, too, can you imagine a world where we had to remit our own income tax to the government? Like, you gave me my whole check, and then I cut you 35%. There would be an uprising immediately. So I knew I liked this guy. He's like, when you actually get away from that, like, really good interviewer and you get some opinion out, I think I like what you're saying. This is great. This is fantastic.
Aaron, a few weeks ago, or maybe it was a month ago now, we were talking on this show, and I had said to Steve, before we knew that Carney was going to be the new Liberal leader, was, whoever they're going to bring in is going to have a short period of time to try to win people over. And Steve basically laughed at me and was like, there is no chance in hell this is happening. Conservatives are going to be a landslide victory. And I felt the same way. And in that interview you did, one of the things that came up is that people over 50 watch the CBC and are maybe going to stay on the Liberal side because they're scared with everything that's going on. And then kind of the younger generation is being conservative, which seems to be the flip of how it used to be. So, like, how did this happen? And I guess you already mentioned that you don't really believe that the polls are quite so close. And this would be the biggest comeback we've ever seen. I would be shocked.
Tom, you got to watch more. You got to watch more of Aaron's episodes, because I mean, it basically breaks down. There's a couple of them that where those people have left what they call mainstream media now, even though I hate that expression.
Legacy
where
media.
Where legacy media is just the Liberal Party. I mean, it is literally just the Liberal Party, right? So anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to sidetrack you there.
No, I think what we're seeing right now, and I continue to push on this. I know when I did the interview with Maxime Bernier and I did the one with David Coletto, I'm critical of the Conservatives on one key thing, and it's that they do not come across as compassionate and empathetic in a lot of different circumstances. And David Coletto pushed back in a good way and basically said, empathetic to the fact that Canadians are struggling is how Pierre has come across throughout his run. But I would just say, when you have Maxime Bernier saying stuff like they're mutilating the children, that is off-putting to a significant demographic of Canadians. That's just like, why? Why do you got to say it like that? Like, why do we have to phrase it in that way? When we talk about the mass grave story for Indigenous people, calling First Nations people hoaxers is not like a productive. We are impoverished, a majority of us, and struggling to make ends meet in communities that are not of the standard of a major metropolis city. We're not hoaxsters. You can absolutely, there are people that I've gone back and forth on Twitter with who have made a business out of kind of pitching their version of what First Nation communities look like. I know they exist, that there's a business model, that they'll bring them on CBC, CTV to kind of give the university's perspective on all these issues, and it's off-putting to many Canadians. But people in my community are not doing this, and we get lumped in with these other individuals that are not reflective of the average First Nations, Inuit, or Métis person that's just trying to make a living like everybody else. And so I think that's the area I'd love to see Pierre Poilievre move towards. I credit him on getting interviews like Jordan Peterson, but I will remind Mr. Poilievre that John Rustad did an interview with Jordan Peterson and it got a lot of views and he did not win the day. Did it help? I'm sure it did, but it did not win the day. You have to speak in a way that all Canadians can hear and want to see a future in. And some Conservatives, I'll blame Candice Malcolm as well, come across really like, yeah, they had trauma like a long time ago, but like, let's move on and like look to the future. And it's like, right, but you haven't held the space for a lot of Canadians who own the fact that for 100 years there was not good circumstances and now we're here. And if he wants to win, that would be my biggest recommendation to him, is the people you're talking about in Toronto are known as empathetic, caring, compassionate people who just want everybody to succeed. And when you kind of make it look like us versus them, or it's a war or it's a battle, they're like, that's not me. I'm not that kind of person. I know a bunch of people who are like, I'm probably going to vote Liberal because I don't like the way Pierre talks. I don't like how he phrases things. I don't like that he's eating an apple, owning a lib. Like, I don't like that kind of person running my country. And that's just off-putting enough to a portion of Canadians who are trying to make a very tough decision between the calm, cool, collected guy and the guy who's known for bullying reporters when he's being asked questions. Are the questions perfect? No. But I think it was David Coletto or somebody else's point that like they still deserve, it was Mike Lecouture from CTV that said like they still deserve respect. And Pierre no longer respects those people. And that's off-putting to so many people.
I don't know. On the other side of that, so if you have, I understand it's off-putting, and I am the brash guy, and I will tell you exactly what I'm thinking just by the look on my face. And Tom is as vanilla as it gets, and he doesn't want to offend anybody. But then, so I hate it when terms are changed to soften the impact that they are having. I hate it. And maybe this is going to get way too political, and Tom, if you turn red, stop me. But like, for instance, we've turned the term, and I do not want to get into this topic, but I just want to illustrate the point. We've turned the term into women's reproductive rights. And that changes the conversation about the original topic. And so, for instance, when you talk about, Aboriginal school hoax or whatever is going on, you have to also understand the point that the other person's trying to make, which is also not an invalid point, right? And so I understand what you're saying. We want compassion. But at the same time, if you sugarcoat everything too much, I think we end up with a Justin Trudeau who just sits there and is a little puff boy that gets beat up when the really bad guys come around. And we have to keep the eye on the focus that there are terrible people out there. There are Putins and Trumps and G's. I didn't say that, President Xi, I swear. But like whoever is out there, there are bad people out there, and we can't nerf the world so much with compassion that we can't actually deal with the topics that are out there. Right. And that's why, again, I'm going to go back to your show. Like, I appreciate the fact that you can have on somebody like it was, I think, Candace or whoever you were referring to, and like have the conversation, which I think is awesome. I think it's more where people need to be these days.
To your point, I think we see that a lot. We call the Defense Department and not the War Department. When it is ultimately the War Department. We call the healthcare system, and not what it actually is, which is a disease addressing system. The healthcare system, I would say, for the most part, is your grocery store, because that's where you get your nutrients, your food, everything you need. That's more healthcare-esque, like gyms, exercise facilities. That's much more a healthcare system than what we actually call them. And we see this in lots of different institutions. We almost reverse the language to get people to participate in the buy-in of them in order to move things forward. I would just say that, like, to your point, we are seeing that moral reckoning as we speak. There are people like Nigel Bagar who come out with a book called Colonialism to kind of question, how the heck did we decide that colonialism was all bad? And I interviewed him. They tried to shut down his talk that was happening at UBC. Instead of letting it be shut down, they tried to push forward with it. I agreed to attend and have a conversation with him so that we could understand the history of colonialism, because it's often treated like it was all bad. And that's not what it actually was. It's far more complicated. It existed for over 150 years. And it was a system, like, again, this is trite, but lots of Indigenous people will talk about decolonization, but they won't talk about decolonizing their car, their TV, their heat pump, all of these tools. And so we're in a complicated time. I think a lot of Canadians sympathize with that position. And that's why Justin Trudeau ultimately left. That's proof that our system works, is because he had to exit stage right because his policies were so unpopular. And now the question is, who's going to right the ship? I think that's a very difficult question. And I think just people don't want Pierre eating an apple and bullying G or somebody else. We want somebody who's going to be a calm, cool, collected person. But where a lot of the Pierre fan base goes is those moments of being a little bit harsh and aggressive. It's often not to the moments where he's diplomatic, fair. And I think he's trying to bring that out now. But that's where a lot of Canadians are scared. They don't want that guy going into Trump's office, eating an apple and trying to own him or something.
The problem is a fan base. Absolutely. Tom, I'm going to ask one more question before I'll let you wrap, because we're coming up here on the end. This is a BC question, BC politics question. Tom, I don't even know if you know this is happening. What do you think of David Eby's push for this new bill that he has, where he doesn't have to pass anything through government because of the big bad man down south, that he wants to put on basically a provincial dictatorship by passing a law that says he no longer needs to go through the legislature to pass laws?
I think the normal answer that I think your viewers and most people are expecting to hear is I am totally against that. I don't think that's necessary. I don't think that's productive. That's like the easy answer. The more complicated answer is, I think every politician who tries to make a move like this ultimately pays a consequence. We saw this with Justin Trudeau and the Emergencies Act. That was incredibly unpopular. There was a moral reckoning on that. Ultimately, the truth won that day, and it was found that that was not a justified approach to take on the trucker convoy. And so we see politicians make these moves, but ultimately I think it's their undoing, and it really shows a lot where their motivations are at. Other provinces aren't doing this, and that's noted by most people who are paying attention to the political movements going on. Doug Ford, I think, has shocked people with how well he's managed a lot of these challenges, and ultimately got reelected for the approach that he's taking. And it is always surprising to me when you think about the political. I think people would expect a conservative government would want that type of power. Just like instinctively, if you think conservative, you'd think they'd want that kind of power. The fact that it's the NDP, a left-leaning organization, wanting that level of power, I think should just make people ask, what does it mean to be left-leaning? Like, to me, that means empowering other people to make the best decision, believing that the more power should be given to the individual to make informed decision on what works best for them, not trying to consolidate power. And we've seen this over the years, that perhaps there isn't a clear line between the two, but it surprises me to see a left-leaning government that is often worried about the disenfranchised, or say they're worried about the disenfranchised, the vulnerable, wanting to have that level of power, because we have not seen that fix many problems throughout our history.
Aaron, you mentioned something earlier and you said you're disagreeable. And I think that's a wonderful trait. And I don't care what anybody says. And I want to just read you. Actually, I wrote this down from a sales training I was at last week, the trainer, and he got everyone pumped up. And he said, attainable and realistic are the words of low achievers. And I rarely write anything down at these. He actually used a different word. He didn't say low achievers. He used a more like, maybe like American way. He said losers. I'm like, okay, well, let's just call this low achievers. But I think being disagreeable, getting what you want in life, going and getting it, pulling up your socks, like you mentioned, I think is awesome. I think this has been such a great conversation, and I'm happy. Normally, I'm the one that's talkative on this show. I'm happy I could just shut up today and just listen to you and let Steve ask the questions, because it was so great. I learned so much. Any words of wisdom to wrap this up for our audience, or anything that we would need to know maybe more about your community that we don't know that's happening right now in 2025 that we can leave the audience with?
First on like what people should know is, despite I think the mass grave story and a lot of questions about what's gone on, reconciliation from my perspective is in fact taking place. And what that means to me is that I'm watching my community members rise out of poverty. I'm watching other First Nation communities rise out of poverty. And I think from an economic perspective, that is good for everybody, because then they're able to be fully fledged participants in the economy, contributing. We have so many issues where we have to bring people in order to do work that Canadians don't want to do. And we have this population that's willing to work hard labor jobs and contribute to our economy in a very meaningful way. And we have to unlock that door if we want to solve a lot of the problems that we have. And I think the time we're in right now, to go to the leaving words for people, we're in a time of increasing hope and an increasing willingness to fight. I think a lot of people are right. We've been a little bit too focused on the past in a lot of ways. We've made Canadians feel bad to be Canadian. We've made it a shame to hold up the Canadian flag. During the trucker protest, a lot of people were like, I'm not holding up that flag. That doesn't represent what I think. Now we're in a time where if you're not holding up that flag, like, are you pro-American? Like, that's kind of the question we're in right now. And so we're in a time where people want to stand for something, and we have to have these types of conversations we're having now of what does it mean to hold up the Canadian flag? What values are you standing up for when you hold up that flag? And that, I think, unites us. And I do think that pushes government to be a little bit more accountable, because when Canadians are united, we ultimately outnumber these individuals in the legislature and parliament, and we have a voice and they have to listen. And again, we watched Justin Trudeau have to listen to our voice and take what we had to say seriously. And I think we have to continue to use that voice as we go through these tumultuous times.
I was at a hockey game last night in Toronto, and I know you can't hear this when you're watching it from home anymore, but there was absolutely boos for the American anthem when it was being sung, like very loud. I couldn't hear it on TV when I watched the other games in Toronto. When standing in that arena, there was boos. So I think, we've talked about this in other episodes, like Canadians now finally have a common enemy that can bring us closer together. And the fact that, like, I want to feel proud when I see the Canadian flag. That's always how I felt my entire life. And I feel like maybe everything that's happening when we get out of this will be in a better place. Steve, you want to wrap it?
Yeah. On that note, I obviously you listen to Jordan Peterson often, I would imagine, Aaron, or once in a while at least. I listened to his interview.
Not as much anymore.
No, I listened to his interview with, I think it's, what's his name from Blackberry, Jim Balsillie?
Balsillie,
right? I have, again, felt more positive as a result of listening to a high achieving Canadian and their outlook moving forward. So I encourage everybody, after you finish on the Bigger Than Me most recent episodes, go check out the Jim Balsillie interview with Jordan Peterson. It was a pretty good one. He also did one on happiness, but I really couldn't get through that one. So I'm working on
stuff for you.
Well, if I can leave you two with a few brief comments. One, it's very challenging to do two hosts. I considered it when I was starting the show. It's very difficult. You guys have managed this very, very well. So kudos to you for both being able to trust the other to kind of lead the conversation in those moments, and perhaps at times have to bite your tongue, because that's the art of what you guys are doing. And that's a unique challenge that I don't have to face, but is a gift when you can have those two different perspectives. Two, I think you both bring a lot of nuance and unique perspectives. And I'm sure that's why you have the following that you have, is because you're willing to take positions that maybe other people don't get to hear as often. And so you should be really proud for stewarding unique ideas and kind of pushing that forward. And I'm just very grateful for both of your time, for being willing to listen to me talk. I'm rarely in the guest chair. And so this was really an honor to be a part of. And I thought you guys managed the time really well and were very thoughtful in your questions. So appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. It's been amazing to have you on the show. I know our audience is going to love this episode. And like Steve said, go check out the Bigger Than Me podcast. Thank you for everybody for listening and watching this week. And we will see you soon. Bye. All right, one second.